My name is Dan Freund, and I'm going to introduce myself, and then Jenna will introduce herself as well. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us, and thank Renee and the Academy for Teachers for letting us join you, but also for putting together all the great programming that you all do. It's really wonderful, and I always have a good time, and I'm sure today will be no different. So again, my name is Dan Freund. I do teach at Bard High School, Early College, Manhattan. I actually went to graduate school with Jenna and Russell. I think I'm the senior member of the three of us in terms of when we started. I'm not sure about when we graduated, but when we started, I was the first of the three of us. I've taught at Bard Manhattan for 14 years, I think. I teach ninth grade history of the Americas. So we do American history, or our version of American history in the ninth grade. And then I've taught college electives in our college program, the history of education class, which I'll talk about today, an environmental history class, an urban history class, and an archival research class. Those are all in my areas of specialty when I was a graduate student. One final thing is we're gonna ask you guys to do a little bit of writing. So if you have a notebook available, or a pen or pencil, or if you want to write on a document or whatever, however you want to do it, but we are going to expect you to do a little bit of writing. It's not going to be too intensive.
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everybody. I'm Jenna Alden. I'm getting a really rosy flashback to my very first job interview 12 years ago when Dan and Renee were in a classroom watching me do a sample class and giving me the most affirming nods that a sample class teacher could ever want. So I'm very happy to be here. I'm so honored to have gotten an opportunity to chat a bit with Dan about this session. We teach at two different branches of Bard High School Early College, which is a franchise that's taking over the world, apparently. We're continually getting new notes about locations that Bard is spreading to. I teach in Queens and Long Island City, and I've been at this location with the scaffolding. Long Island City is, as always, full of scaffolding since 2010 is when I started teaching here. I teach ninth grade history of the Americas like Dan. He in fact provided me with so many of my early training materials and some of my most choice pieces of wisdom that I now pass along to other new teachers. I teach college electives like Dan. So for anyone who doesn't know about our school, students in their third and fourth year get college credit for classes they take with us. So we get to come up with all sorts of weird classes. One of my weird classes is the cultural history of self-help. I also teach conformity and its critics in the 1950s, history of consumer culture, and then Why School? American Education and Its Critics, which I will be talking about today. I'm so happy to be here with you, and I can't wait to hear what Dan has to say.
All right, so as I said, we're going to ask you all to do a little bit of writing, and we'll really start with it. We'd like you to basically answer the question that frames this class, right? We're gonna, or this Academy for Teachers event. We'd like you to just take a couple minutes and write privately. We're not going to require you to share this, but from your perspective, what is education for? So it's a little different from what is school for, but what is education for?
Yeah, we would just love, I know it's a big ask on Zoom when we're all strangers, and at least some of us are, but we were wondering if anyone would be willing to use the raise hand function and just share out with us a little bit about what they wrote and how they answered that question. Yeah, Jose.
I condensed it to provide knowledge and opportunity. I teach special ed elementary. This year I'm 3-4 bridge class. So I feel like my work is really to provide the foundation that the kids need in order to go to higher level of education, hopefully high school, college, and further. But yeah, my focus is to give my kids with their special needs the opportunity to be able to grow, share my knowledge, give them the opportunities that other kids have. And that's what I try to do. And it's not just in education. I'm talking about, belief in themselves, believe that they can, learn and grow, and that they may have whatever disability they have. And it doesn't mean that they don't have the same opportunity to learn and grow and be whatever they want. So that's why I condensed it into those 5 words.
Thanks so much, Jose. And Jonathan, you wrote critical member of a collective. Do you want to speak to that a little?
Yeah, and so like I think a lot about sort of the distinction between like schooling and education. And I think a lot about like Baldwin, right? And talks about the paradox of education, and these aspects of like being a critical member, I think begins with sort of on an individual level, be building those sort of critical analytical skills. But sort of the connection to that, the connection to the collective is that you become, you are by effect a part of a collective in being part of a nation or a community or et cetera. But in that critique, or in the ability to develop critiques, allows you to sort of support, enhance, enrich the community or collective that you are a part of. And so while it might begin with the individual, I think there was a lot of people sort of mentioning this term critical being a really big, important part as it relates to your connection to some larger group.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Alyssa?
Sure. So in a similar vein, thinking about education as a mechanism for society to become more just, to become more equitable, for people to be good citizens that make the planet better for people and non-people entities. And I had written my 4 words. So I wrote citizenship, community, humanity, betterment. I was like, there's something missing. And then I put joy, because I think also like life is meant to be enjoyed in the company of each other. And looking at my students as they recover, from the trauma of this pandemic, like let's just have fun. And I think that fun and learning go hand in hand. So that was the last word I put.
Thank you so much. I see that in the answers here for the 5 words, there are some kind of lofty ideas about what we all hope education can be, and then some other words about the reality of how schools can play out. Like Jonathan was speaking, the difference between schooling and education. And I know we'll be fleshing out some of those distinctions today, but thank you so much for your contributions. And Dan, I think with that, we will all pass the collective baton over to you for your presentation.
All right, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about what kind of how I envision the class as a part of a historical discipline. And then I'm hoping I shared with all of you, or I hope I shared with all of you, a document that had about 2 pages of assorted student works. I'm hoping you guys had a chance to look at those and think about those, and then maybe we could think about them together. But before I get into that, I think of this class as an important contribution to the study of history for our students. One of the things I really like about the history of education is that you really can talk about the history of the United States through a history of education. And I just want to acknowledge Jonathan's point, which is that most education historically and probably now takes place outside of school, right? Most kids are learning more from their families, from their communities, from their churches, from the institutions around them. They learn more from those things than they learn from school. And I'm gonna go out on a limb. I hope they learn more from those things than they learn from me in school. So I will recognize that, but I do think that in the United States, from its early years, institutional organized education has been a fundamental part of the project of the nation, and for better and sometimes for worse, right? So I do think that you can sort of tell this story of American history through education, or through the history of education. And one exercise I like to do early on, when students really have no idea what the field is, they don't know what a history of education would look like, they don't know what questions they would ask, I ask students to do something fairly basic, which is list 10 events, ideas, movements that they remember from US history. Just list 10. And then I have them sort of brainstorm about how those might have intersected with the history of education itself, right? So maybe they talk about the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1950s and 1960s, and that immediately leads them to a consideration of things like school integration. Those of them who are a little more intrepid might talk about how kind of ideas about liberation, some of the ideas that Russell was talking about last week, ideas about freedom and liberation might actually play out or not in schools, right? So students intuitively understand that there is a history of the United States that is married to a history of education. More specifically, I think you could talk about the progressive era, right? And you could think through the progressive era through vocational education, right, which was a major movement in the early 20th century, which is married to industrialization. You could also think about the efforts to Americanize immigrants, also central to both the progressive era and education, right? So you can think through kind of major trends in American history through the history of education, reinforce some of that learning that may or may not have been done in my 9th grade class. And I always like that opportunity. The other thing I just want to flag is that I think it's great to think about history as a discipline. So that's one of the reasons you'll notice that Jenna's class and my class are fairly different in many regards. We're different people. We teach in different ways. I think that the Department of Education would do well to recognize that we educators have ways of doing things that might be different and still make sense. So Jenna, so I move fairly chronologically in my class. And that's because I want them to see history as a discipline that tends to move through time chronologically. But I also really like to use different look at different sorts of historical methodologies. So I was just looking back over my syllabus, and I have several texts that are kind of broad ideas in the history of education books, which maybe is what you would expect. But there's also a historian who spends a lot of time thinking about the ideologies prevalent in the early republic and how that influenced education, right? A social historian who looked at broad urban trends in the 1950s and their intersection with education. I look at the work of linguists. I even have a biologist on the syllabus. If you haven't read Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man, it's not new, but he's a biologist doing history. And this gets to one of the profound challenges, because the thing that's most absent, I think, in so many of these books is student voices. It's very hard to capture the voice of students or the thinking of students historically, because most of them did not leave record of their experiences. So 2 books that try to get at that and allow us to talk about that as a problem there's a historian, Paula Fass, who writes this. She talks about after-school programs in New York City, which were one of the few ways you could get at what students were signing themselves up for. And it allows you to see kind of how they were responding to efforts to channel them in certain directions. And then there's another wonderful book by a sociologist who's looked at the experience of Mexican immigrants in Los Angeles today. I mean, it's very current, and that also gets at student voices. But part of what I want to get at with all of this material is to think through how historians explore these issues, how history as a discipline works through a problem like, the history of education, and how diverse non-historical voices enter into that story or enter into that field as well. But that last point, I just want to flag that it's really hard to consider this. The question about the book, I'll get to the titles of books in a little bit, but one of the things that's really challenging, as I just said, is that you so infrequently hear from kids in so much of this literature. Sometimes you'll hear adults thinking back to their childhood, but hearing from kids themselves, and that's actually one of the wonderful parts of this class as well. This class is an opportunity to hear from young people about their experience of being young people in schools. And I have to say, it's wonderful to hear. It's incredibly harrowing to hear. It's often very upsetting to hear. I took down some of the things, your 5 words, creative, exploring, expanding, agency, opening up new worlds, creating collectives, humanity, joy, right? Like, this is not their experience of school for the most part. And there's no class that confronts you with that more regularly and in more challenging ways. So with that, I wanted us to talk about some of the things that students had observed. It occurs to me that sometimes I go to professional development events, or we have them in our school, where we look at student work, but it's almost always to norm things or to talk about whether learning objectives are being met. And today I was hoping we could look at this student work with an eye towards what they can teach us and what questions they prompt in us and how they can give shape to our classes, because that's ultimately what some of these assignments were. I'm going to put in the chat the document that I shared in case you either want to reference it and have seen it, or you didn't get a chance to look at it. That should get it to you. The settings should be open so that any of you can have a look. But I was really hoping you could just take a minute or two and kind of orient yourself. And I'd love to hear from you all what stood out to you as themes that you think could structure a class or classes in the history of education, right? And I'll just write that in the chat. I always wind up writing these things anew. So that again is just to think through for a few minutes. And again, I'll just give you a minute to orient yourselves. All right. So I was gonna do a little, put it in the chat and then share, but I would love it if we could just skip the chat part and move to the sharing part. Kind of, what did you notice in this student work that would cause you to, that you think you could kind of organize a class or a series of classes or a semester around? Yeah, Molly?
Hi, I think that the themes of segregation of schools and attempts to desegregate schools and, you know, where we are today with that is something that a lot of students can engage with and should engage with. And that would be one theme that would stand out to me for sure.
Thank you. Caitlin?
Hi, yeah, I was really intrigued. I keep coming back to that first question: whose interest does education serve? And all of these, all of these questions in this response, and like how this ties into some of the other questions that appear below. I'm really inspired by that.
Sarah?
Yeah, can everybody hear me? Okay, great. I guess I was interested in this idea of education as sort of self-emancipatory, especially the idea on the third page. There's a quote that says, educators must prepare for the possibility that there are things that children want to learn that they will be unable to teach them. And it kind of echoed something in the video last week about like everybody is an expert. When you talk about like education as liberation, that we release the hold on who knows and it sort of becomes much more communal, and definitely don't see that happening in school right now.
Anything else that stood out? Elisa?
Alyssa, yeah, I guess I'll say,
Sorry.
no worries. My favorite workshop norm for working with teachers is we all agree that no one is an expert and no one is a fool. And thinking about that in the context of education, and like these questions are really incisive and really good, and thinking about like who gets served and also who gets to decide who gets served. Another question that I took away from last week's talk was who gets to decide what gets included in schools, right? Like what are the parameters? Why do we have science and math and history, and like, who makes those decisions? And so I see a lot of that coming out in these student questions, and yeah, that's where I'm at.
Anyone else? I think one of the things that I like about that last comment that is worth flagging is students don't ask themselves who gets to make those decisions for the most part. But like that's not a present question in their lives. Although when asked, who do you think is making these decisions? It's a curiosity to them. They're interested in that as a question, but they fundamentally don't think it's one that they're being asked to ask. And so, the class, insofar as I'm able, does try to use student questions. I'll just say briefly that the way I use these is I used to have I one time tried to have students bring in their own questions and then they would ask them. And the problem is that class was incredibly disorganized, right? Because they're not creating their questions in a relationship to each other. And neither are they, if they're writing 4 questions, neither is there necessarily a relationship internal to the single student. So I have students submit these questions in the morning, and I create a lesson plan, some of which is what I want to accomplish, and some of it is these questions, which I generally ask anonymously, since they submit them since they're submitting them to me and they're not saying this is my question to their classmates. I'll say this is a student question generally, and if whoever wants to take ownership of it, they can. But I do that. I'm almost out of time for my section. I just want to say a few things about what the class has been historically, and one opportunity that it hasn't been that I think it could be. I absolutely think that anyone who's teaching a US history survey class, or a class on government actually, could have a 2-week unit that engages with the history of education around a particular time period. So I already mentioned the progressive era in the 1960s. I absolutely think you could design a unit of study that would explore the history of education as a way into to a particular moment in US history. I actually would love to hear that. I think it's an interesting idea. I've never done it myself, but I have thought about doing it. And the other thing is, there's an origin story to this class that's maybe worth telling briefly. This class was first taught, I think, in 2007. I first taught it in 2010, and I actually co-taught it with a math teacher. It was attached to a teaching practicum and a tutorial in which we matched our 11th and 12th graders with 9th graders, had a sort of teaching practicum, how you would tutor, how you could help those kids, and attached that to a history of education class. So as the kids were studying the history of education, they were also in this tutorial about how to teach and how to engage with younger students. And they were doing the work of mentoring and tutoring students. It was a major commitment for them, but that did exist for 1 year until we couldn't afford to have two teachers co-teaching a class together. And then the tutorial part fell off and it became a standalone history of education class. But I just want to give a sense of sort of the possibilities out there. And with that, I'm excited to hear your questions for the Q&A. I would be happy to talk about any of these things a little further, but I want to make sure that Jenna has plenty of time to share with you her class.
Thank you so much, Dan. I would want to take your class and see more of that student work. And hi, everybody. I'm feeling a little Zoom rusty, which is like the best sentence to utter ever. I'm so glad to be Zoom rusty. I'm like, how do I share a screen? But I am about to share a screen. And also I did prepare some notes I'll be referencing, which I've never quite tried to do at the same time. So bear with me while I do screen sharing. I hope this works. Oh, allow Zoom to share a screen. Open system preferences. Guys, I have a new computer at work. Oh no, you'd think I would have practiced. All right. Allow. Oh no. Dan, Renee, I might need to log on a different computer. Can somebody stall while I do that?
I've got a really good soft shoe dance that I've prepared for just an occasion like this, but I'm afraid.
Oh wait, I have a question. I actually had a video that I was wishing I had had time for in my presentation, and I wonder if, hold on one second. Well, actually, no, I'm not gonna send it. I'm just gonna have to log out for a second and ask you guys to stall while I sign in on a different computer. This is all very nostalgic. This is what last year was like. I'm so sorry, everybody. All right, I'll be back, but I will leave this meeting to join.
Excellent. I think this is a great time to take some questions for Dan, to see if you've got questions about the experience he's had in this class, ideas you have about how you might carry it forward into your own classes. So go ahead if you would, and feel free to use the raise your hand function. Pablo, jump in.
So I was wondering if Dan or if anyone else here has posed the question, what is school for? What is the purpose of school to their students? I've actually been asking this of a lot of students that I interact with, and I work with a lot of teachers, and I've been asking them to ask students this question, and I've been kind of compiling their answers, and I've gotten a lot of very interesting answers, but I'm wondering if anyone's asked that and what kind of answers they get from their kids.
I will say one thing is that is actually this is actually the title of Jenna's class. So it's posed on the syllabus, and she will talk a little bit further about how she engages students over the course of weeks around those questions. I definitely do. Not so much in my 9th grade class, but definitely in my in this class, it's central to the project of the class.
And do they tend to respond with like the ideals like we've put, or the realities of like what school really is? How do kids tend to respond?
I think they move in two directions, right? I mean, some students will, 75% of students will start by telling you what they think you want to hear, right? And then I make clear that that's not actually what I want to hear, and then they can open up a little more. But there is a clear division between some students who see it as all about opportunity and learning and growth and getting good jobs, which is often where a lot of them wind up. And some of them see it as a few of them will see it as agents of socialization by the state to create Americans. I mean, but it does break down pretty broadly.
Great. And Alyssa, we're going to hold on to your question if we may, and move to Jenna, and then we'll come back to Q&A afterwards. So Jenna, take it away.
Hi, Renee. I'm so sorry about that. Not surprised.
No problem.
But sorry. All right, I will take it away. Okay, here we go. Let's hope this works. All right, now I just need to be mindful of my time. Here we go. Y'all see that? Can you see it, Renee? Yep. It's loading? Okay.
Yep.
All right. It's still loading. Ah, there we go. All right. So I didn't mean to do that. Hi there. I'm breathing. I'm deep breathing. So I'm Jenna Alden. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Renee. Today, I want to talk to you all a little bit about the radical possibilities of teaching school. Again, different from the teaching education topic we've been talking about. And I'll be sharing some materials from an elective I teach called Why School? American Education and Its Critics. This is an interdisciplinary college elective that blends cultural theory, sociology, and education history. It's not a traditional history of education so much as it is like a cultural history of the idea of school. The elective itself evolved from a mini unit for 9th graders in my History of the Americas survey class. And I believe it was really useful at that level too. So I'd be happy to reflect on that later in our session about how to take snippets of this larger elective and make it work for 9th graders, just like Dan spoke about. So Why School is hands down my favorite course to teach. And it has been out of all my 11 years of teaching at Bard. And it's also by far my most popular elective. It turns out kids are really hungry to talk about this stuff, all the stuff we're talking about today, to an extent I never anticipated. I want to start with some personal context. So I started developing Why School after returning from 2 years out of the classroom when I was on parental leave with my second son. He's on the left, that's Max. In that time, my older son, who's at right, that's Linus, had started kindergarten and we were having a rough go of it. Starting from the age of 4, he was repeatedly getting punished with the removal of recess because he was over socializing with his little band of misfits, bottom right, when it was time to do worksheets. I saw him get labeled as a bad kid. Meanwhile, my husband and I were getting in trouble, we're both teachers by the way, for not completing all of his nightly homework with him. We grappled with the demands of kindergarten at his traditional public school. Enforcing rules at home meant angst for all of us, but resisting didn't feel right either. Like we weren't being team players or supporting a kindergarten teacher who herself exuded stress about the demands placed on her to reach particular reading levels at particular benchmarks. So this all fuels some serious seeking. What are we doing to these kids? What are we doing to families, and why, and is it worth it? I started diving into books on that topic in search of answers. And one of them that I happen to particularly love is The Importance of Being Little. But then there was also some much broader social context that we've already alluded to today. On my own playground in Jackson Heights, Queens, I listened as middle-class parents talked about hiring tutors so their 4-year-olds could ace the GNT test and attend schools outside the diverse neighborhood I thought we all took so much pride in. I became aware of the work of a local group called JH People for Public Schools, one of whose leaders recently published this article in Chalkbeat, and it's really good. Her name's Amanda Vender. And I also started learning a lot more about the broader efforts of groups like Integrate NYC and Teens Take Charge, where students really take the lead. So in short, I started paying a lot more attention to the project of integrating New York City public schools with a growing awareness of the segregation that people like me had let unfold throughout the city as we either ignored it or actively perpetuated it. Finally, there was something visceral that happened after returning to the building after 2 years away, the experience of encountering an old familiar thing in an unfamiliar way. I encountered students who were sleep deprived and electric with anxiety. They waited through 4 hours of homework a night, sometimes quitting sports and the arts to stay on top of it. In the classroom, I watched some of my students actively engage in our discussions, which I've certainly tried so hard, exhaustingly to make engaging, while others yearnfully gazed at the clock, begging it to tick faster, or rushed to secretly complete overdue assignments for other classes under their desks. When I started asking students about their boredom, a good number, and stress, a good number of them talked about school as something that was happening to them, like they were cogs in a machine, going through the motions without a particular sense of purpose. I found myself unable to explain what it was all about, and so I set out to figure it out with them. Is school a prison, as its harshest critics suggest, or a space of liberation and enlightenment, as many of us educators would like to believe, and as was evidenced in the chat? It turns out my students had plenty to say and many more questions of their own. So here's a sample of questions that my students generated on the very first day of class. I love the sweetness of why does nap time stop after age 5, but there are also a lot more serious ones. Why do gifted kids get more resources? What are outcomes for homeschooled kids versus traditional kids? How do gender distinctions play? And the most popular question of all of my time teaching this class, why don't we learn about financial literacy or home economics? I never knew how much teenagers wanted to learn how to do their taxes until I started teaching this class. They really want to learn how to do their taxes. They also had a lot of offerings. They continue to pour in. So here's one amazing broken clock meme. Who fixes a clock like this? The answer is the United States education system. And then I've never shared a TikTok over Zoom before, and clearly my history so far this session is not promising, but I'm going to try it. So the text on this TikTok says, the fact that these 2 events occurred within an hour, ugh, I love public school. This was sent to me like 3 days ago by a student. It's been viewed 2.5 million times, maybe 2.6 by now. Let's try to watch it together.
I'm very safe. Oh my gosh. I thought you said
Sometimes I just like watch that on repeat. It seems to capture like the pure absurdity of plenty of our students' days. My big takeaways after 3 years of teaching Y School are these. So first, teaching about education can be a radical enterprise when it grants permission to critique conditions that feel inevitable. There's a tendency for students and teachers alike to think like, how else would we do it? Like, this isn't ideal, but, and I myself often feel that way. We're part of this larger bureaucratic madness. But it's so important to carve a space for both figuring out how we got here and imagining alternatives. So today I'll focus largely on 2 units, having given that lengthy introduction of the course that address, on the one hand, the radical critiques, and on the other hand, the radical imaginings. I'll start with how I structured the course. And it is, by the way, a total ever-evolving beast. I'm always tinkering with it. I'll spend the most time today discussing the first unit, which is called School Smackdown, exclamation point, exclamation point. Because it's different from a conventional history of education class. And this unit has inspired some particularly exciting conversations. The big question of this unit is, according to radical critics, how can we link schools to power, oppression, and the maintenance of cultural norms? We start with John Taylor Gatto. Students love hearing an award-winning New York public school teacher rail against the system for generating obedience, conformity, and what he calls emotional dependence on rewards like stickers or grades. He writes, the lesson of report cards, grades, and tests is that children should not trust themselves or their parents, but should instead rely on the evaluation of certified officials. People need to be told what they are worth. I'll mention here that on the first day of class, I always have students write these very kind of like micro memoirs, one about a very positive memory of class and one about a negative, or a memory of school, and one a negative memory of school. The positives tend to be from elementary school, memories of play and creativity, whereas the negative tend largely to be linked to maybe late middle school and high school, and particularly linked to exams and grades. So students can often locate the moment when they felt labeled as dumb or simply not good enough. From there, we move to Foucault here with his very intimidating glare. Michel Foucault, an excerpt from his book, Discipline and Punish, which I just should note is so hard, but we break it down. It's a hard book. I give 15 pages. My students tell me it feels like 150, but a big part of our class is trying to figure out what's usable here. Foucault offers the panopticon, which is this model of prison architecture where the guards sit in the middle and at all times can see the prisoners all around them, as a metaphor for power in modern institutions. When we unpack him in our class, we do a silent walking tour of the school. That's our school, by the way. There's like literally a giant open atrium in the middle of the building. So although there's not a tower of guards there, it's still particularly helpful. As we walk around, I ask students just to take notes and jot down where and how are adults able to observe students. So spoiler alert, everywhere. There is no privacy in school, even a relatively relaxed and kind of touchy-feely school environment like ours, where students don't need hall passes and such. And I realize that's a privilege in and of itself. We talk about other forms of surveillance too. Michel Foucault suggests schools serve the same social function as prisons and mental institutions to define, classify, control, and regulate people. We talk about quizzes, the organization of desks. In our school, I do have to admit, they're much more often in a circle or rectangle. We talk about the fact that bathroom doors always have gaps at the bottom, so you're never totally invisible. It's also always important to poke a little fun at Foucault and his very serious Frenchness. So I always offer a slide of memes. I've learned the hard way that reading memes aloud is not funny, so I won't do it now. I'll give you a second to soak these in. Okay. All right, so next up we ask, what's the relationship between schoolwork and wage labor in a capitalist society? My students just the other day compared these images. And we try to think about the ways that school work is a preparation for other kinds of work. Malcolm Harris does some great writing on the function of homework on a socioeconomic level. Here's a whiteboard my kids in class wrote the other day. He has this idea of kid-shaped capital. He says, first a kid decides to invest her time in math homework, then she spends the hours running through equations. The next morning she wakes up a more valuable future employee. We use that, I should say, by the way, we use that as a chance to reflect on the workload at Bard and also the logic that justifies it. Gintis and Bowles published this book in 1976, and it's dense and it can feel impenetrable, but my students often leave the discussion of Gintis and Bowles, like them talking about it throughout the rest of the semester. They write, schooling fosters and rewards the development of certain capacities and the expression of certain needs while thwarting and penalizing others. So obedience and timeliness and good time management is rewarded, while creativity and individuality and kind of questioning authority too much gets penalized. They write, through these institutional relationships, the educational system tailors the aspirations and social class identifications of individuals to the requirements of the social division of labor. That is a total mouthful, I know. So to talk about it, we examine this pair of images, one from a charter school in Brooklyn and the other from a private Waldorf school outside of DC. We talk about, but I guess the question we ask is, how are these different schools producing different kinds of workers? What qualities are they producing or encouraging? What forms of self-identification are encouraged in environments? This is a total simplification. I curated it, I rigged it. I'm always honest about that with my schools. There are plenty of happy pictures of charter schools out there, and I'm sure that the Waldorf kids aren't always dancing on desks, but it still works. As a pedagogical exercise, it works. Finally, Nicole Hannah-Jones is our tour guide through contemporary segregation in NYC, founder of the 1619 Project and New York Times education reporter. She writes about the ways that family choices perpetuate segregation in our system. And these questions particularly resonate at Bard because we're a screen school. Excuse me. So one of our projects in Why School the Class is to consider, though we are a very diverse school and we love to celebrate that aspect of ourselves, how are we implicated in New York City's segregated school system? Teens Take Charge, the activist group, says screened schools like ours should be eliminated altogether. Are they right? We have a lot of this semester to work that question out together. So one big takeaway from the Smackdown unit, which I realize is really depressing, is that, and what I see students responding to is that they're not crazy for thinking the system is broken or punishing. It's been empowering to validate student experiences of school, to let them to align with fiercely articulate critics, but also great to see them question the authority and generalizations of those critics. So every time I sign a text, I'm always asking, are you persuaded by this critique? Now, sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. They tend to question, for instance, John Gatto's nostalgia for education in the pre-Civil War past. We talk about the fact that there is great danger in romanticizing anything about the pre-Civil War past as some kind of heyday for American education when enslaved human beings were not allowed to learn how to read. But one of the best parts of the class has been that students themselves are authorities. Their past 12 to 14 years lend them a powerful expertise they simply don't have in other classes. I'm going to do a quick, especially for the sake of time, I'll just say that having laid out those radical critiques, then we back up and do the historical question that all my classes tend to be structured around, which is how did we get here? And this is where we do actually get a bit chronological. We begin a chronological examination of the roots of American education. I should note I am not a scholar of education. My background is in the cultural history of business, though there's lots of overlap. So I don't pretend that this is a comprehensive survey, kind of like a greatest hits I see. We talk briefly about the roots of American education, the mid-19th century, the development of the common school, Horace Mann's creation, schools tasked with the project of nation building and framed as great equalizers. We learn about the growth of Black-led education after the Civil War, a moment of true hope, collective action, and progress before backlash. I learned about Charlotte Horton through the book Teacher Wars by Dana Goldstein. I hadn't heard of her before, and now I can't believe I hadn't. She was a teacher who worked with freed people of the Sea Islands in South Carolina during the Civil War. I'm trying to read this quote, my Zoom thing is in the way. She wrote, before teaching them the John Brown song, which they learned to sing with great spirit, I told them about Toussaint, thinking it well they should know what one of their own color had done for his race. This is in the 1860s. Then we move from that early idealism to the project of making marginalized students useful and American, asking what's the relationship between schools and assimilation? I'm sure many of us have heard of the Native American boarding schools like the Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania, whose famous motto was, kill the Indian to save the man. There are lots and lots of these makeover portraits because Colonel Richard H. Pratt, the founder, commissioned portraits to be taken to show donors that, hey, it's working. We look at the Tuskegee Institute, run by Booker T. Washington, and examine what it means to cast down your bucket where you are in the context of education. At the same time, by the way, contrasting his ideas to those of W.B. Du Bois and looking at ways that the contrast is often kind of exaggerated or caricatured. We look at the rise and fall of home ec, ideas about learning gender through the curriculum of domestic science and the so-called professionalization of housework. All right, so then Unit 4, Enter the Dreamers. This is where I'll spend another little chunk of time. I know the clock is racing. Here's where we get to do some collective dreaming as a class, and also where we get to leave the building. I love leaving the building. We all love leaving the building. John Dewey and Caroline Pratt are our tour guides through progressive education. I learned about Caroline Pratt through her book, I Learned from Children, which is so beautiful and inspiring and like a total joy. Caroline Pratt is the inventor of the wooden block. Somebody invented that for children. And wooden blocks were a huge part of her school, the City and Country School in New York City. She and Dewey shared the idea that children are natural learners, that learning works best when it's collaborative and experiential. And this is key, that such learning benefits both the individual learner and democratic society. That was central to that progressive education vision, and also certainly connected to the progressive era in ways that Dan talked about. Students in this unit design their own experiential lessons inspired by Pratt's work at the City and Country School, and I just want to briefly share one with you here. Students designed a lesson on the fermentation in bread. The audience is mostly younger students, but everyone really. The objective is make bread and learn why it forms. What I love is that in a spirit of experiential education, it starts by giving young students ingredients with no instructions. Just tell them to make bread. Number 2, the bread fails because they are little kids and of course they don't know how to make bread. Then they move into independent small group research on the correct ratios. They make better bread. Now they're interested in why they were more successful the second time around. Then they want to learn and they do a study of fermentation. In fall of 2019, my students and I took a field trip to Ella Baker School in Manhattan. It's a public school with a progressive curriculum to watch progressive learning in action. So we watched tiny people perform their own choreographed dances and work on creative writing and group stations. And then the students who are pictured here led the most awesome Q&A for us, where they talked about their education and how they explained it to others. The youngest guy there was maybe 8 or 9. A more radical case study is A.S. Neil's Summerhill, which was founded in 1921 in England. And we look at that in connection with its legacy in the modern free school movement. So free schools, which, as the Atlantic article says here, have no teachers, no class, no homework. It's often caricatured, but the idea of free schools is that students have total freedom to pursue what they want. There are no grade levels, there are no exams. Students pursue what they're interested in. And the critical part that's often overlooked is that democratic meetings and organization are a total centerpiece, that the students run the school having equal power as the teachers. The idea is if we want to have democratic societies, we need democratic schools, not authoritarian ones. In my mini unit for 9th graders, that was where this class came from, we listened to an episode of This American Life about a segment about the Brooklyn Free School in Brooklyn, Fort Greene, where there's no required curriculum or grades or homework or tests. And then my students took a field trip there to meet the students and ask about their experiences. A surprising revelation was all of my students thought they would definitely want to go to a free school when we learned about it, but after we visited, they said it seemed awesome, but it didn't have enough structure and they thought maybe they shouldn't go. Miles Horton and Paulo Freire offer us schools as agents of liberation in the mid-20th century. Miles Horton is also someone I hadn't known about before, and now I don't understand how. He worked in Appalachia with labor unions and in Southern freedom schools with the civil rights movement. Freire, many of us know, ran literacy programs for the poor people of Brazil. This book of dialogue, We Make the Road by Walking, is beautiful. It's literally a transcript of these 2 men in conversation. They both have really beautiful beards and they have this tremendous mutual admiration. And I think it offers a nice alternative to the dense writing and pedagogy of the oppressed, which is wonderful, but can be a little hard for my students to access. I feel like in this conversation, the ideas are equally powerful, but just expressed in a little bit more conversational language. This moment allows us an opportunity to ponder, what would it mean to apply the pedagogy of the oppressed to the marginalized communities of NYC? Finally, and this will be familiar to anyone who attended last week's session, we look at Afrocentric schools and other brands of identity-based education. So starting in the 1970s and then moving into now, the Ember Charter School operates out of Brooklyn and has an Afrocentric curriculum. It's for Black and Brown kids. The big question here is integration always the best option for marginalized students? We look at education for Indigenous kids, for LGBTQ plus kids, and other institutions that eschew integration for a focus on identity-based history and empowerment. In short, we use this unit as an opportunity to broadly imagine alternatives guided by historical examples and think, how would we reform mainstream education today if we could? Now, I am not an educational policy buff by any stretch, and a different person could work students through the ins and outs of reform on the bureaucratic level and talk about budgets. But I have to admit, I tend to keep us in the clouds with the dreamers. I just figure that's a decent place to start. I'll do the briefest sketch here. We end our class with a final unit on neoliberal realities and debating topics in modern education. Students get to pick which topics they want to explore in a series of in-class debates: homework, pro or con; standardized tests, pro or con; tracking, pro or con. They read the research on both sides and then discuss it in class and see where they land. They also do presentations on a variety of plans to integrate the schools of New York City, with different teams assigned to different proposals, ditching the specialized high school exam, eliminating the gifted and talented program, which looks like it might happen, sort of. Finally, after years of pushing, reforming middle school admissions and ending screening at all New York City high schools like ours. The course objective in a nutshell, and this is where I'm wrapping up, is to bridge radical critique and lofty social imagination. My big goal is for students to remember that institutions are built by flawed humans. They are not inevitable and they are not set in stone. I want to end by sharing a quote from my man, Miles Horton. When people criticize me for not having any respect for existing structures and institutions, I protest. I say I give institutions and structures and traditions all the respect that I think they deserve. That's usually mighty little, but there are things that I do respect. They have to earn that respect. They have to earn it by serving people. They don't earn it just by age or legality or tradition. So I hope that in my class, we can use education as a laboratory for this brand of critical examination of powerful institutions writ large. It would be my dream if that was what students left the course with. Now I will end by saying that today was a curated snapshot of my class, and there's so much my course doesn't yet explore in the depth I'd like, in addition to whatever I left out today. Bilingual education, more about gender and sexuality, more about vocational education, religious education. I would love to hear about inspiring texts from others, whether it's in our Q&A time or over email someday. And so I've included my contact info, and Dan would also like me to include his. We're both people who are eager to keep this conversation going. So if there's something that you think of today that you don't get to say to us or in breakout groups, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, Dan and Jenna. Those were amazing. There is so much delicious food for thought here. So we've got about 10 minutes to open the floor for Q&A before we send you off into some small groups. So let's use that, our favorite Zoom raise your hand function, and please feel free to pose a question, bring up an inspiring text, whatever has really emerged from what resonated with you in these two presentations. And we're not at all concerned about giving you a few moments to think, given the richness of the material. Sarah, jump in.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone, Renee and the Academy, for planning this, and the presentations have been awesome. I just would ask either of the presenters to comment on, have there been any effects school-wide from the work you've done in these courses? Has this had any sort of reverberations in terms of changes that happened at your school or institutional pushback? It sounds like Bard's a pretty liberal place, but I'd just be really curious if there've been any other like ripple effects from the work you're doing on critically examining education.
Dan, do you want to start?
I mean, there hasn't been anything negative. I don't. No, there have been no negative impacts. There was actually one thing that happened where we were trying to figure out a way to create a student center, and some students came up with, it was actually in an urban history class, did an urban history analysis of how you, or sorry, an urban studies analysis of how you could structure space in the building. And that was actually met positively by the administration, but there's not been pushback in any of my classes, I don't think.
I can share something that was maybe an example of a positive thing. So 4 of my students from the first iteration of Y School ended up doing a tutorial with me on the history of screening in New York City schools. It was the 4 of them. And the final project was they produced a podcast about whether our school should be de-screened. But the beautiful thing about it was they interviewed so many people who are connected to our institution. Because it's like a franchise, they interviewed principals, the head of the early colleges, deans, students, people at all the different versions of BARD. And then they were allowed to present their findings at a principals meeting. I don't know what that changes, except I think we wanted to keep the conversation about screening alive. There's a tendency at a school that's like a great school that's also diverse to be like, check, our work is done. And I think those students and I really wanted to be aware of who doesn't get to be here, and how we could be implicated in a larger system. So sometimes the answer is, well, we've had more conversations, but at least we start there.
Wonderful. Thank you. Jonathan, would you like to jump in? And make sure you're unmuted.
There you go. I just want to say first and foremost, thank you for everything and for the presentations. I teach a unit, so I teach AP language and I teach 12th grade English. In my 12th grade English course, we're actually going to jump into our mini education unit after we write our college essays, right? To sort of make that link. And in my AP language course, we do it. It's just one of the thematic units after we look at all the skills that we're doing for the AP exam. And my question is, one of the things, there are times, I've taught it 2 times. There are times where students sort of have opportunity, or they express that they feel going into education is all about, like, you know, getting a job and making money, and then that's all you can do. I wanted to know what sort of things can offer balance or offer altering perspectives from that, because we have things like that, but students sort of still just go, oh no, I'm just, you know, going to secure, you know, to say it in their words, secure this bag, and that's all it's about. Yeah, just wanted to see some thoughts on that.
Are you thinking particularly about like texts that could inspire students to think about school and their educations in a different way?
Yes.
I'll share my slideshow with the group through Renee, and I would say that I think the work of some of the dreamers I talked about would be in my category of that, because they had a completely different idea than this kind of current neoliberal moment about what school is for.
I actually think that John Dewey's Democracy in Education is where I have some of my best discussions around that, in part because he has this radical proposition, I think it's fairly radical, that, and he's not alone, but that school should sort of be, that you should think of your education as sort of objectiveless. Like you're not only are you not supposed to be working towards getting a job, but you should not be working towards the fully adult version of yourself. You should be discovering that, right? And I think that sort of the more radical proposition, which is that object-oriented education, goal-oriented education in general is problematic, forces the students to sort of be like, well, if not that, then what? And I actually think that that's the really interesting conversation, is what if we say that the goal of school, or the goal of being young, is to be young, right? And so I think that I think moving in the 5 steps beyond that, it's not just about getting a job, is really interesting, and forces me to think about, well, then what is it for? Like, does that actually make sense? And they see me every year. I read and talk about this every year. They see me grappling with that, because I can't answer it.
Thank you. Yeah, Molly, please.
Hi, I work at a transfer school, so students transfer there after having usually years of failure at their previous school, and a lot of them I would characterize as traumatized by school. And I think if I asked my students what did they think the purpose of school is, I think a lot of them would not say the purpose of school is education. Like, I don't think that that's the purpose and to them. And I think they're right in some cases. I don't think that their schools in the past have really focused on education. And in that context, I think some of my students would be interested to grapple with the history of education and the purpose of education and why school and how could school look different. But then we still are going to come up against the situation where they've been at schools that have allowed them to fail regents 5 times in a row. And now we still need them to pass the regents for them to graduate, to move on from school. And like, so we're in this system that is still continuing to traumatize them in the exact same ways. And we can't really immediately change the system, and we can talk about the purpose of school. But do you have any thoughts on how to have a productive conversation in a space where that's the situation and there will be high tensions and emotions and fears?
I think about that all the time, Molly. I wish I had better answers. We have a significant population of students with disabilities here, and they feel really battered. And they've been told they're not good a lot of times. My first answer feels so touchy-feely and so not systemic enough. And it's that there's a lot of power in empathy and listening and telling them they're not crazy. But that's a really good question. Like, those kids still got to pass the regents. They still got to graduate from high school, and empathy and listening don't change that fact. Sounds like they're really lucky to have you. And sometimes I think that the care and empathy coming from adults can mean a lot, but again, it doesn't change the structures. And I don't know what other people think about that.
I just want to jump in here a second and say that it's interesting to hear all this talk about the structures and that schools are propagating the culture and power structures. But from where I sit, I mean, there is all that. School is a prison. There's all these. I mean, who would, go to school by choice, except for people who have a calling to teach? And that's the part of it that is so moving, and that's the salvation to me, is and the tragedy of education in America is that teaching is not accorded the respect that it deserves, and that it's not more widely known how rewarding the profession is, as is evidenced by the just amazing stuff you guys are talking about and the wonderful experiences you have with your students. So to me, there's this contradiction here between the prison aspect of it and the savior aspect of it. And you guys are the saviors working within this system, and we have to keep you guys inspired and going on so that things move forward. But it's society is always going to want to control. Of course, school is a babysitting machine, and it keeps the economy going. There's all sorts of sort of unpleasant realities about school, but you guys change lives, and teachers always change lives. That's the heart of the whole endeavor, as far as I'm concerned.
One thing that I don't want to. I want to make sure we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, if that's possible. But the reality, we've been having a problem with students not attending classes at our school, which is fairly new. It's not something that's happened often at our school. And what they're doing is, many of them are deciding that they would rather play basketball. And an administrator said to me, what are you doing to make your class more exciting than basketball? And my response is, I cannot compete with basketball. And in fact, I would like to be playing basketball as well, right? So that's my way of saying I am a jailer to some extent, right? Like, I am saying, or not a jailer, I'm the one who's saying, take your medicine, right? Like, I'm a bad nurse, or not a bad nurse, I'm a nurse, right? Like, I'm saying you got to come to history class because you got to come to history class. Basketball, I'm not going to tell you I'm going to be more fun than basketball, because I'm not going to lie to your face, and I'm lying, and I know I'm lying. I'm not going to do that. So I do think that there's an element that is challenging about that. The other thing, Molly, and I just want to say, one thing that I do think is, I don't know if City As I don't think it's a transfer school. Is it a transfer school? Does anyone know if City As is a transfer school? It is. City As is I think, really an interesting thing for me to think about, which is, for those of you who know about it, you know about it. For those of you who don't, my understanding is you spend a ton of time outside of school, engaging with the city, doing work outside the city. And I think that one of the things that a history of education can point to is those many different models that are not conventional school and that do give kids successes, right? I mean, there are successes to be had that are more important than the regions. I would say, including basketball, which I think is more important than the regions, except that you need regions to graduate and you don't need basketball to graduate, right? But like, I do think that there are moments or models in the history of education where you're forced to ask, have these people tried to rethink what the goal is? And getting the, encouraging students to ask that question. And then for me, confessing all the times that I have self-doubt that I'm on the right side of the ledger, kids are like, they like that, I'm like, oh man, I am really not doing right by you today. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say. I think that's terrible. I shouldn't say that, but I think that sort of those other models, and Jenna, it sounds like your curriculum is rich with those. Encourages kids to ask the question of like, oh, is there another thing that's also valid, that is my jam, is my thing, is really a nice opportunity. Sorry, that was way too long.
I think we've got a couple of questions yet to go. I'm going to make an executive decision that we stay in this large group because I think these questions are very rich, and I'm not seeing any angry looks from the screens that I see in front of me. So because I think one of the things we really like about small groups is it gives teachers a great chance to say hi to a couple of other people in the room and to share what's resonating. But I also think there's such value with these really important questions of everybody hearing the same questions and being able to think through this together. And because we have 10 minutes left, I'd love to turn the floor first over to Mark, and then we'll go to Jean. And my only request, if possible, is that you keep your question as brief as possible so that we can get through one or two more before the end of the session. So Mark, take it away. And you'll want to make sure you're unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, this is not so much of a question as an observation. And I mean, I go back to an earlier generation of teaching. And I taught in Elizabeth Irwin High School, a very progressive school. And Elizabeth Irwin's motto was the classroom without walls. And one of the things when I started teaching, the galleries were opening up in Soho. And I really do want to thank Jenny and Daniel, because I think it's wonderful the way you're opening up the classroom. But the way I opened up the classroom was to start taking the kids to these galleries. And of course, they love getting out of class. And they would have a log in which they would write about what they saw in the galleries and then come back. But I mean, basically, I agree with all of you. I wish this was more widespread. But opening up the school, having the kids respond either to what they saw in galleries or even current events and things and I agreed totally with Daniel that school is about young people and in their youth. And basically, I'm just affirming what everybody has been saying. And I wish there was more of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Well, let's turn then to Jean. Jean, would you like to jump in with your question?
Yeah, well, as a special ed administrator and as the parent of a student with a child with robust ADHD, this is really interesting to me because I wrestled with the same, right? Because I'm in charge of implementing these programs that are supposed to make all students feel like they belong and that the way that they learn is a good way to learn. And yet I also have a child, and then sometimes I get angry because I'm like, on both ends, but what I'm wrestling with, right, is I think we have this expectation that we're supposed to love school, that kids are supposed to love school. And I think that's unrealistic because I don't love my job all the time, right? I don't. But I do think a realistic expectation is that they're supposed to learn about how they learn. And if I, as a special ed administrator, can make sure that all of my students can leave knowing that this is how they learn best, this is how it is ineffective for how they learn, then I know I'm empowering them with the ability to curate their life to feel more successful and confident. I wish I had known. I'm great at moderating meetings because I have a hard time paying attention, but if it's a discussion, I can pay attention. So I'm able to pick a career that better fits me. And so that's what I look at when I see my child in the lowest level reading group. Instead of getting disheartened, I think, okay, well, but she's really good at reading a room, right? So how do I leverage her understanding of herself to be able to curate her life choices after that? And I hope that that helps. And I just want to say thank you. You guys did such a great job making us feel cared about with the amount of time you put into this presentation.
I actually think that there were two ideas embedded in that. I mean, one is a question of, as a teacher, what is my goal for students, right? To learn how you learn. But the other was a question was, you started off by saying that not all kids are going to love school. And I think, and that's a question of motivation, right? How do you motivate kids? I think that's a different question, right? Like, and I think, the motivation, I agree with you. I don't think it's realistic to expect everyone to love school. I do think that what we have to find, and one of the things that I love about Jenna's class is, I think the kids have to see value in school, even if they don't love it. There's lots of things that I see value in that I don't love. But if kids neither love it nor see value in it, and it makes them feel cruddy about themselves, I mean, that's hopeless. And when I say value, I don't mean value for like their future job prospects. I already said I'm not a fan of that model, right? But like, to see that there's something meaningful. And honestly, right now, I got ninth graders, they're fresh to our school, and a lot of them don't see value in it. And I have to convince them that they're wrong.
Daniel, I think you're making a great point, Daniel, right? And I think what's important about that point is, as teachers, we put so much of ourselves in our lessons. And I don't know about you, but if I have a bad lesson, I feel bad as a person. Yeah. And so sometimes it's also hard to extricate, right, our self-evaluations with the fact that we're doing the best in a system that's difficult to change.
Wonderful. So, Jose, I think we've got enough time for your question.
So it wasn't really a question so much as, again, piggybacking off that last conversation. Again, I teach elementary, so I'm not in kind of the same boat that you guys are at in a lot of what you're talking about, but the point that she made about making school interesting. So one thing, that I've seen is the kids miss the connections, these last, 2 years where we've been doing this Zoom, and there's not that social relationship. And that's something that, I embed in my classroom. And that's something that makes them want to come to school. Because every day I ask the question, I start my day with, how are you doing today? How are you feeling today? And, sometimes I get, I'm tired, or, I'm tired, I wish I was home. But most of the times I get, I'm happy. And the reason why is I'm happy to be here at school with my friends. So, you have to make time within, all of the teaching that we do to give them time to bond and make up for that lost 2 years of, non-personal communication. And I think that's something that can help them, look forward to coming to school. Maybe not love it, but get extra invested in it. That's all.
Can I add one quick note? Oh, I'm sorry,
Yes,
Renee.
please.
I
was actually just going to ask if the two of you would like to say something before we wrap up today.
Oh, that's so nice. All right, I'm gonna try to be super swift then. First of all, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the work of Alfie Kohn. I don't know if you are, who wrote Punished by Rewards, but he does really interesting writing about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. And that's been a really useful model to me. Extrinsic motivation is when you're motivated because you don't want your teacher to get mad and call your mom, and you don't want to get a bad grade, or because you do want a good grade. You do want your mom to hear you do great. Intrinsic is when it comes from you. And the more I teach, the more I find that it's so much easier to locate that in experiential projects and assignments. And I want to give a big plug for anyone teaching the history of school that my assignments often, the midterm essay is about interviewing other people in their lives about school. I think if you can take what happens in the classroom and make it part of a larger conversation, or like my tutorial students doing a podcast, that can feel meaningful because they're taking what happens in this little box closed off from the world and then bringing it to others and saying, hey, I learned this. What do you think about it? So I just wanted to give that quick plug.
Thank you.
I actually don't. I mean, one thing that just to follow up on what Jen was saying is it's really revelatory for kids when you admit that you cannot actually coerce them into learning. They have to decide to learn. And I think that that observation about intrinsic and extrinsic rewards, I think is really kind of spot on, that it's a partnership. And there's actually, there's a book by Catherine Neckerman who writes about Chicago in the 1950s. And she writes about the failure of school systems to convey to African-American children that they're meaningful and that they should want to learn in a system. And I think her last chapter is about authority and engagement, which I think gets at it from a different perspective. But I think that extrinsic and intrinsic is really interesting, but I don't have anything to put it all together.
That's beautiful. Well, we are at the 6 o'clock hour. So I want both to acknowledge how full of amazing ideas and really beautiful thinking has gone into these presentations, and to acknowledge the way that Jenna and Dan, you've engaged us in this richness over the course of the last hour and a half. We all talk a lot about how hard teachers work to make the classroom a place where students feel valued and they want to engage. But I think one of the things that a session like this also shows is not only how we can learn how to do that, but how important it is that we share exactly the same kind of exciting ferment of ideas that the best classroom can have. And I think this session has given us a wonderful way to kind of walk thinking about all of this rich material and indeed the ways in which talking about school can enhance our students' experiences, both of history and of the rest of their experiences in the classroom.